1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. Now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but one love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world and that there is no God but one. Good morning, friends. We are continuing our studies in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul compares between love and knowledge. He says, we know that we all possess knowledge, and knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. In other words, what he says, if you have knowledge, it is likely to make you arrogant because you think you know. But in fact, what we need is not only knowledge, but also primarily we need love, because love builds up. In verse 2, he says, the man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. If you're only anchoring your life in knowledge, then Paul says, you think that you know, but the knowledge, the body of knowledge is so vast that you think you know, but actually it implies you still need to know something more. There is still vast area that you still are completely ignorant of. But Paul says in verse 3, but the man who loves God is known by God. Person who anchors his life in the love of God, he says, God knows you. And so God knows you, you are connected to God. You are likely to have a connection, a source of the knowledge of God. And God can reveal much more knowledge to you. You are likely to be humble, and that's the better deal in your life. So compared to knowledge and love, primarily we must seek the love of God in our heart. And of course we do need knowledge as well. Then he goes on to talk about food sacrificed to idol. Remember, as I told you, Paul was living in a context where there are many other religions and people worship gods and goddesses. He says in verse 5, for even if there are so-called gods, first of all, in verse 4 he says, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world and that there is no God but one. We all believe that there is only one God. On the other hand, but there are people who believe that there are gods and goddesses. You know, gods with a small letter, not capital letter, Paul goes on to explain. So even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, but as for us, we believe that there is only God, one God, the Father from whom all things come, and for whom we live, and there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came, through whom we live. So, in other words, Paul says, actually there is no other God, there is only one God. And so if any food is sacrificed to idols, there's nothing, because there is only one God. So you and I have freedom to eat any kinds of food, because the ultimate powerful God, the Creator God, we already know, and that's the actual power that exists. Other powers doesn't exist. That is immaterial. However, he says, be careful. In verse 9, he says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? He says there are people who may not know this Creator God, the only God, the ultimate God, the mighty God, who only knows these smaller gods, and they are so much preoccupied with their thought. So food sacrificed to these idols makes a lot of sense to them. They are connected to this smaller God. So when you are entering a temple and eating these food offered to idols, they are emboldened. They are reaffirmed in their faith into this so-called gods with a small letter. Their faith in that small gods can be affirmed. So he says you have to balance your freedom as well as accountability, your responsibility towards these men and women. Verse 12, When you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. In other words, if you push someone who do not know God, who is ignorant of the real God, into their journey into darkness, into something which is not God, actually you become responsible. You help them to continue living in sin and recognizing a God which does not exist. So how to balance between those two things? Verse 13 of chapter 8, Paul concludes, he said, "Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall." In other words, you have to be sensitive to the local cultural context, to their belief. You should practice freedom, but your practice of freedom should be with sense of accountability and responsibility. May God help us as we live in a pluralistic society. Help us to be sensitive to their religion, and yet we must be responsible to introduce this living God to them. May God bless you. You have a wonderful day. Blessings.